Hey everyone, I'm Marie Lynn Miranda, Provost here at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm happy to welcome you to the third installment of Industry Insights. Industry Insights is a series of one-on-one interviews with thought leaders from a variety of industry sectors that we host to provide our Notre Dame family and community with real-time insights from these leaders as they guide their organizations through these challenging times. I'm especially pleased to welcome a longtime friend and distinguished technology industry leader, the CEO of IBM, Arvind Krishna. IBM, sometimes referred to as Big Blue, is one of the world's largest employers with more than 350,000 employees, and it's a global company with some 70% of its workforce outside of the United States. During his 30-year career with IBM before becoming its CEO in April, Arvind led IBM's expansion into new markets, including artificial intelligence, cloud and quantum computing, and blockchain technology. He also played a major role developing products and solutions based on these new technologies. In 2019, Arvind successfully closed IBM's $34 billion acquisition of open source software company Red Hat, IBM's largest acquisition ever, in a move that will help IBM define the future for hybrid cloud services. Arvind is a distinguished graduate of the Indian Institute of Technology and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he earned his PhD. In 2016, Wired magazine concluded what I have known for a long time when it named Arvind one of the geniuses who are creating the future of the technology sector. Arvind, we're so pleased to welcome you. It's great to have you join us.
Marie Lynn, it's a pleasure to be here talking to you, one of my favorite people and a great university. What a pleasure.
There you go. I'm going to jump right in and start asking you questions. I'm going to start by asking questions about the pandemic. What was it like for you to take over a global company during a global pandemic?
So I was elected or named to be CEO on January 31. I wish we had known then what we got to know about 4 to 6 weeks later. I'd spent the prior week in Davos and there was no talk of the pandemic. In hindsight, that seems silly. It shows how much we as humans like to live in our own bubbles because it was there. It was very present in Wuhan. There were signs of it spreading already over East Asia. But in the West, we were ignoring it, even in Davos, which has people from all over the globe. Then, by the middle of February, there were murmurs throughout the business world. By the end of February, we knew it was coming. Now, we maybe got lucky or maybe we were smart. We had just stress tested at IBM. Could we bring 300,000 people to work from home or from wherever they happen to be? Maybe we are a little bit obsessive about this. We just wanted to stress test that. And we had done that in the middle of February. So when we had to in the first and second week of March, we were able to get all our people to work from home. That was important because of the mission critical nature of the services we provide to our clients. So 98% people working from home by the second week of March globally. And we feel really good about that with all the productivity. But getting past work, it's really important to give people a psychological set of well-being and safety. What do you do around healthcare? Can you cover all the extra costs for testing? Can you make sure that people who need access to prescription drugs can get hold of them? And so there's a whole set of activities that we did to make sure that health is provided, and that gave people a set of, I'll call it safety. And the third piece, Arlen, is that in the pandemic, suddenly people are on screens, much like we are here. And not everybody is set up to have isolated spaces. So how do you say to people that it's okay to work from home? You don't need to have your camera on all the time. Just because you're home and so your workplace and your home is the same does not mean you're obligated to spend 24 hours a day whenever somebody feels like jump on a video call or an in-person call. It's all right that kids or dogs or parents or others walk by behind you, but nobody's expecting you to do that. It's also okay to turn your camera off if that's what you need. It's okay to schedule an hour or 2 or 3 if you have to take care of other things because you are now all in the same space. So the mixture of make sure that we're doing the work correctly that all our clients want, And we can talk about those tools later because I believe there's a big opportunity for not just us, but for others. Make sure that you're covering health and psychological well-being. And three, really get to what should be the new model of work. By the way, I think there'll be a tremendous amount of research, hopefully by some of your colleagues, around what does this new way of work mean now that I'll call it the factory or the industrial model. We have shown that you can actually work in some kind of hybrid model going into the future.
Yeah. So Arvind, I'm so impressed with the approach that you've taken, your attention to what does it mean for people who are working from home and have other responsibilities as well. I'm glad to know that it's okay if your dogs or your kids show up in pictures. That's always a likelihood for me. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how important you think that this is in particular for the females in your workforce or the working parents more broadly in your workforce.
It's so working parents, and I think especially working mothers. Look, much as we have all made, I'll call it massive progress on gender equality, and we can also talk about other forms of social justice going forward into this conversation, right? As an example, you're a provost at a major university, a major research university, which I think till the 1940s would have been unthinkable. So that's a great example of progress. However, I do think that progress is very limited and it's in pockets. It's not across the board. And as we think through this, I really have a fear. It's grounded in some data, but it's not been fully researched yet, that working mothers are going to take more of a hit in the current pandemic than working parents even in general. But even working parents will. Look, in most cities, like I live here in the Northeast, most schools, best case, are hybrid, meaning 3 days a week the kids are home. Many others are 5 days a week the kids are home. Well, who exactly do you think is providing all the attention and care those children need? It's often going to be the load will fall on the mother. And so consequently, I think that we have to lean extra into it to make sure that we can support them. You can do small actions. Like we told our people, look, if you have to for the next year and you want to go live somewhere else where you have more support, go do it. Don't worry about it. We'll guarantee that your role and your job will stay in place when you return next summer. Or if you need to have unusual hours, or if you want to go part-time, you got to offer all the support possible that is going to be there for such conditions. But I'm actually worried about whether if this pandemic continues for a year plus in terms of isolating people, whether it's going to have a disproportionate impact on working mothers and working parents. And by the way, I think that extends even more once you hit the lower income demographics, because I think there it becomes even harder because if you get into the upper income demographics, they can still afford to get care and so forth. So these are issues that I think are rife with a lot of social implications for society.
Right. Yeah, we're certainly seeing evidence in the research world that the number of papers submitted by women, the number of grant proposals submitted by women, all of those have gone down in this 6 or 7 months that we've been in the pandemic and related to all of these sorts of issues. So maybe there are ways that IBM and Notre Dame can partner to try to figure out what are the kinds of things we need to be doing for our working parents and in particular our working moms. I share your concern about that. So aside from, arranging, in addition to all of the challenges associated with the remote work, et cetera, what are some of the other critical challenges that you faced related to the pandemic since you took over in April?
Yeah, so Marie Lynn, great question. So we began with the health crisis, and that certainly occupies media attention, and because health it is literally a matter of life and death, it does take a lot of this. But that led to an economic crisis because as government shut down correctly, as people began to focus on cash preservation, et cetera, that has led to an economic crisis, and we are still in the middle of that economic crisis. Then, of course, we had, at least in this country, but in some others as well, there's a whole question around social justice that got driven starting in the month of May. So we are in the middle of these three crises. Do they amplify each other, or do they help mitigate some of the concerns? I don't know. My gut feeling is that you're already sensitized to two issues, and then you get sensitized to all three. And the economic crisis means that all companies have to now think about how do they create some kind of balanced business. And we do believe in stakeholder capitalism. So you owe it not just to your shareholders, you also owe it to your employees, to your clients, and to the communities that you work and live in. So you have to worry about all of those. So it's not one of those, it's all of those. And so worrying about all of that. So clearly, I mean, the global GDP current estimates are anywhere from 4 to 8% down, I think, if I remember. Some of the draconian estimates early on have gone away when people talked about 15 to 30%. But I do think that from an economic perspective, this is the worst crisis we've been in since World War II. And we've been in at least three, I think, at best count, at least three bad crises since then, right? I'm thinking of the oil embargo and the stagflation was one, then certainly the 01 dot-com crisis and the 08 financial crisis, to name three. This is worse than any of those, is my gut sense. Now, that said, there is a lot of positives also. So government certainly acted much quicker this time to put stimulus in. And we know that stimulus funding can stave off some of the worst aspects. By the way, they also let businesses survive, because many businesses, if they get some help for 3 months or 6 months, can then turn around and find themselves in a healthy place. And in the end, business is what provides a lot of employment and incomes back into the economy. The second aspect is that I think companies became quicker to react also in terms of cash preservation. So that's sort of going on at a macro level. Then for companies like us, we had to pivot very quickly to what is the work that people want done. And so we found that unlike the prior to crisis, a lot of people were not taking the short-term fix of, hey, let me just cut spending for 3 months or 6 months. Most people said, this is the time to make a big digital transformation to our enterprise. How do I use digital transformation to really get closer to my clients? How do I really get my employees more engaged? Let's take a hard look at which work does not need to be done or really has very little value, and let's not do it. So as people are using the crisis to accelerate their transformations, that means it's upon us to help them make those transformations. And the two forces that really are driving that are cloud and artificial intelligence. And those are two big forces. And I know people don't think of you as artificial intelligence, but I know from your data background, in the end, artificial intelligence is another way to go play with data. It's not more than that. So I know you get that really intuitively and with expertise. But those are the two forces that then give a positive side to all of the crisis that is happening right now.
Yeah. So Arvind, I'm going to switch from the pandemic to business strategy. As you know, Arvind, my parents bought IBM stock in my name when I was very young with some money that I earned. I can neither confirm nor deny that I earned that money as a child model. Cannot confirm or deny that. So I've been an IBM stockholder for 50 years. Which is way longer than the mere 30 years that you've been working for IBM. So I just want to ask a few questions to make sure that you're taking good care of my company. Okay. So first one is, I'm sure that everybody who's watching has read about the recent move to split IBM into two separate companies, with NewCo focused on modernizing your clients' legacy systems and migrating them to the cloud, and the other focused on cloud computing and artificial intelligence. I'm going to read from a quote that you gave the press at the time this was announced that said, "We divested networking back in the 1990s, we divested PCs back in the 2000s, we divested semiconductors about 5 years ago because all of them didn't necessarily play into the integrated value proposition." Even with the clear direction that technology is taking toward cloud computing and artificial intelligence, refocusing and spinning off legacy systems, it's a bold move, and an especially big move in the middle of a pandemic. So walk us through how IBM came to that decision.
Sure, Marie Lynn. And I got to begin by telling the audience that you probably have a negative cost basis for the financial majors out there in your stock, since you've held it for 50 years. And we have paid out so many dividends. But actually, thank you very much, and for the audience to hear. By the way, we have a very large number of shareholders, just like Marie Lynn. and we do actually depend upon them, and we like to look after them extremely well by offering a very stable dividend. So let me just begin with that. But back to your more serious part of the question. Look, we're in an industry where what's of value changes all the time. And it's really important to participate in the areas where there is value. And in the other areas, you've got to keep transforming yourself. Fundamentally, we believe that the role IBM plays is to be essential in a technology sense for our enterprise and government clients. So when we look at that, it means how do you help them make their retail banking go better? How do you make them make their airplanes fly safely and on time? How do you make reservation systems function? How do you make sure that both inter-country and interbank money transfers happen safely? Those are the kinds of things we happen to do, and we happen to do well. So it's in that context that you begin to look at what are clients purchasing today, how do they purchase it, and how do they want to do things going forward. If I go back to the early 90s, because that led to the examples on when I said networking and PCs, et cetera, that was a time when the world was moving from what was called, I'll call it data center, glass house, some of you can say mainframe-centric computing, to the next layer that got it added on was client server. And that is a term, but for your audience, many of whom were probably not even alive till 10 years after that term got invented, I'll say, think of it as the era of PCs, workstations, and the internet coming on. And by the way, all of those reinforced each other. As 10 years went by, the value in those became, it was just part of the standard. Much like you don't think of electricity as being differentiated, it comes from a plug in the wall. So as those, you go on, yes, clients need those things, but they're much better done by somebody who's focused on efficiency, very high service quality, as opposed to innovation and keeping on modifying that. So that led to those going on. By the way, that collection led to a lot of heterogeneity and complexity in our clients' environments. So what we call managed infrastructure services had a huge role to play because people had mainframes and mid-range systems and Unix systems and Linux systems and Windows from a dozen different hardware providers and another dozen storage providers. So there was a lot of value in the expertise you bring to do what's called infrastructure services. As time has gone on and you see the movement to cloud happening, both public and private cloud, yes, that's very important, but the attention of our clients has now moved to saying, how do I modernize my applications to work much more in this environment? And so you take that as being a kind of a macro environment of the behavior that is happening out there. The second thing you observe, we are in an industry, you can debate, is it 2 or 3 trillion in total? The information technology industry is what I mean by that, which is significant. But let me just point out, there are other industries that are much, much bigger. Health is much bigger, and energy is much bigger as an industry. But this one is growing. But where is that growth coming from now? So about $1 trillion is the market estimate of what's happening in hybrid cloud. And by hybrid cloud, I mean the collection of multiple public clouds, because I think nobody in their right mind should only be on one public cloud. You got to use multiple. You're going to use a bunch of as-a-service providers. For this audience, think of things like Salesforce and companies like that as being as-a-service providers. You're also going to have some things on-premise. And why do you want to have something in your own data center? Well, if you're doing surgery, you probably want really low latency, so you are going to do a bunch of things locally. If you're in a factory, you're probably going to make some decisions with artificial intelligence, most likely, but they need to be made locally. Maybe for privacy, maybe for regulatory reasons, maybe for reasons of history, by which I mean there is no economic value to rewriting something which cost you $100 million to rewrite, so you're going to keep it. So this mixture of private, public, and as a service is a big market that we are terming hybrid cloud. It's estimated to be about $1 trillion market growing in double digits. So to focus in on that and to say, but infrastructure services is an important market, but is much more driven by efficiency, automation, et cetera. That's 2 different business models. So that says, as probably some of your research economists would tell me, hey, if you have 2 different business models, that probably is appropriate to keep it as 2 different firms. And that's the reason that we're going about doing it. And the quote you read out was my example. This is not the first time our industry has gone through this. We've been doing it before. And networking companies, by the way, didn't exist till about the early 1990s. They were all collapsed inside other enterprise tech companies. Then it made sense. It was its own market with different attributes that those companies came to be. And I think that this is now time on infrastructure services for that same play to work out. And by the way, when you optimize your capital allocation, you optimize your employment, you optimize the skills that you do, you easily unlock 10, 20, 30% more productivity in each of the respective companies.
Okay. So I know that you're still, it's called NewCo right now, and you're still coming up with the name. I'm just going to put in a plug. You could name it after my dad, who believed in you way back when. So I'm going to talk about another key business decision, and that's the acquisition of Red Hat. It's certainly consistent with your emphasis on cloud computing and artificial intelligence, but tell us more about that decision to acquire Red Hat, and how do you think the acquisition is going to position IBM for the future?
Really important question, Marie Lynn, and I'm glad you brought that up. So if I look at it, the observation that I'm making on hybrid cloud as the destination, not as a way stop, about the new computing environment, right? So just a quick recap. Era one, mainframe, you can say 1965 to maybe 1985. Era two, client server, we can go 1985 to circa 2015. Now we're getting into the era of cloud. All right, so is it going to be a singular public cloud, or is it going to be multiple? Is it going to be multiple? People are also going to have private cloud. So if you say that's the environment, then you begin to ask the question. In our technology world, we use the word platforms or architectures. And so the architecture that is going to win this one, I think we'll all agree, Linux has become the most predominant operating system. There's another collection of technologies, I'll call it containers and Kubernetes. Even for the business and English majors out there, you should know what the terms mean, the same way as everyone now knows the term smartphone and networking, et cetera. So if you assume and then believe that that's the architecture, then you ask the question, is it going to be based on proprietary systems or open systems? And we have a very fundamental belief that it's going to be open systems. By the way, that's not based on dogma, that's based on kind of what makes most economic sense. Right. When you look at the number of people who contribute to something like a project like Linux, you could say that's 8 million people. Not every single one's innovation makes it in, but that's the number of people whose innovation could make it into that system. There is no single enterprise on the planet that's going to have that much innovation contained within its boundaries. So we believed very strongly that you need to have this innovation out in the open. Two, then you say the architecture of Linux containers Kubernetes is what will drive the most value for our clients. So if you have both those beliefs and the world is moving to hybrid cloud, then we said, how can we accelerate this trend? And bringing Red Hat and IBM together, I think was actually good for both. So it wasn't just IBM gaining Red Hat. Red Hat then also gained all our enterprise capabilities to take that technology out to every client to actually accelerate what they're doing. And by the way, the numbers show that. There's an acceleration in Red Hat adoption over the last 2 years. So that's something we're very, very proud of. But it's equally important at that time to make sure Red Hat remains open. So there is no intention to make Red Hat into something proprietary. Red Hat remains true to its open source culture. It'll remain in that world. And IBM will help take it to many, many more clients and get the deployment going. So if I was to give myself a scorecard on that one, I'm a harsh grader, by the way. I'm not a provost like you, but I'm a very harsh grader inside. That's one of the rare things I give ourselves an A on. And as a shareholder, you should feel happy because A's there imply that that return comes back to you over time.
That's right. Yeah. So your sort of history of these different eras, I'm realizing that I've gone through all of those eras. So I told you know about my parents, my dad in particular, buying the IBM stock. But the first job I had after my cannot neither confirm nor deny child modeling career was I worked as the night operator at the computer center at the University of Detroit, which was very close to where I grew up. And I remember mounting tapes on the tape drives in the big IBM SPO that I worked at. And I remember the first time I got a personal computer when I was in graduate school, and it had a 20 kilobyte hard drive. And I was state of the art. So and our research team, we're very much operating in that cloud environment. So I've appreciated all of these changes over time and have been doing dividend reinvestment all along. So another information technology company that, and you may remember that it's my favorite information technology company, is the Weather Company, which is sometimes confused with the Weather Channel, that cable network that's owned by an entertainment system. But all the underlying digital assets and data assets that feed the Weather Channel are within the Weather Company, and IBM acquired that, which was super exciting for me because I love all those digital assets so much. So I have to ask about it. How has the acquisition of the Weather Company back in 2016 played out for IBM?
Wonderful. Look, so we talked a little bit about cloud and the big arcs of computer architecture, but the second one that I think everyone can relate to is data, and everything spits out data now. So when we acquired the Weather Company, it was all about proving a thesis and learning from the Weather Company, how do you take care of large amounts of data? I think if I remember right, they generate about 20 petabytes of data a day that they bring in from all kinds of sensors. Rather, people don't know this. There are sensors on aircraft, so pretty much every flying airplane puts out data at different altitudes, because knowing things not just at ground level, but knowing things in the atmosphere helps. Satellites put it out. Every government puts out large data sets. I think there's 200,000 personal weather stations people have which put out data. So the idea becomes, how do you ingest all that data? How do you then operate on that data, algorithms or weather models for the geeks out there? And then how do you produce forecasts that are accurate? And then the question becomes, how long are the forecasts accurate for? Are they good for 24 hours or 48 or 96? And such an improvement, people don't realize this. Forecasts beyond 24 hours were not very accurate 10 years ago. And today, they're quite accurate up to about 96 hours out. Now you can get 10-day and 20-day, and then the goal becomes, how can you make those more and more accurate as you go out? Second part, many of you like hyper-localized weather. So how localized can you make the weather? Is your forecast cell 10 miles by 10 miles, or is it 100 meters by 100 meters? And bringing all those in, and then being able to give people exactly what they need by watching their location, not watching the person. We don't do anything around collecting any PII. And putting all that together, I think is wonderful. It's by the way helped us. So we can take some of the same technologies and use them in how we help people do maintenance of machines, because then it's back to data, mixing it up with other data, providing an insight that they can use going back. And it's a great use case for our cloud technologies also, because it operates on our cloud globally. So the latency, the uptime, the sheer amount of computation, the data ingestion, all are places where there's a healthy tension between the engineers who are consuming it, the weather company folks, and then the cloud engineers who are providing it. So it pushes us and makes us even better for the rest of our clients. So by the way, and any of you who watched, I mean, those are not pleasant, but whether it was Hurricane Isaiah or Laura, or back to one that I know, Marie Lynn, you were deeply involved in helping out with Harvey. Those are all examples then where we're actually providing a public service also. Because the service, by the way, the weather company on a website is free to use. It really helps people understand what's coming, what could happen, and what should they do, et cetera. So it feels great to be able to mix the purpose there of doing tech for good, along with doing deep technology.
Yeah. So I everybody, there's a standing joke that if you don't know what to talk about, you can always talk about the weather. But my husband and I love to talk about the weather, but really delving into the science. One of the things that I love about the weather company is that it actually has a lot of people sort of digging in a little bit deeper than just looking at the icons across the screen and trying to understand, well, what is that Doppler? How do they do a Doppler, and what does that Doppler signal show us? And it's a really fun and interesting way to get more the general population involved in thinking about science. So I always like that too. I'm going to segue now to the relationship between IBM and Notre Dame. So at Notre Dame, we are certainly committed to corporate university partnerships. They provide excellent opportunities for faculty and staff and students, and they contribute especially students, and they contribute tremendously to our research and teaching missions. Corporate university partnerships have changed over the years, mostly due to the changing needs of companies. So what do you see as the benefits to companies of entering into these corporate university partnerships?
Well, it's a great question. So I want to step back all the way to some basics. So the lifeblood of any company is its people and the innovation that we can bring to market. Those are the two things. And so where do you get the best people? It's like the old Willie Hutton joke. Well, they asked him, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. So why do we work with universities? Because that's where the smart people are. So we would love to get more and more of your smart students to come to work at IBM. And so consequently, one way of getting, I'll just call it exposure to them in both directions, is by working with the university. So let's not put aside that very, very basic need that we all have. But the second need is innovation. We don't have all the smart ideas inside our place. There are some topics that, by the way, are so hard that likely only a university would work at them. But if you work on them and if you make progress, they could have huge impacts on society. And maybe we'll be one of the beneficiaries, maybe not the only. So in order to drive both those, it's really important, I think, that universities and companies work together. We work together by bringing students as interns. We work together by sponsoring research. By the way, you cannot bias it. You sponsor the research, and then the faculty will do the research as they find fit and with their students, and then they will publish on it. So no controls and no restrictions on all that. Contrary to what students might hear about other industries doing different things, we don't believe that any of that is appropriate. But also, it's very important sometimes that there is a problem where you do have maybe a dozen people in the world who are true experts on it, and some of them are at a university. And so they can work on that in a way that can cause some breakthrough thinking. And there are areas also where I think it is better for universities to do the fundamental work than companies. And when we think about areas like artificial intelligence, the impact on humanity, the impact on bias in data, the impact on ethics are all areas we'll touch on, but it's really important, I think, to be able to work together on it. But access to really smart students, access to really smart faculty, the chance to get more innovation quicker, I think that's a pretty good win-win-win.
Yeah, and a win-win-win for us as well. So in June, Notre Dame and IBM launched the Tech Ethics Lab, funded by a $20 million gift from IBM over 10 years, so thank you for that. The collaboration is designed to address the myriad ethical concerns raised by the use of advanced technologies, including artificial intelligence, machine learning, and quantum computing to address society's most pressing problems. Why was the investment important to IBM, and why choose Notre Dame as your partner? I think you chose the right partner, but why do you think we were the right partner?
Look, I think Notre Dame has a great history of functioning at this boundary of society, innovation, advanced research, and you bring that thinking. It's got a great law school, it's got a great engineering school, it's got a great liberal arts school. You combine them all, and then you begin to look at the problems. So also, many of your students may not know, Notre Dame has done a lot of groundbreaking work in network dynamics, in many areas of also using the internet as a social tool. In social media, by the way, your students should go read some of that stuff from some of your Faculty, I presume they're still there, but who knows? Faculty also tend to move on. But to go back to ethics and tech ethics, look, artificial intelligence is here to stay. The cat's out of the bag. It is going to be used. When we think about the zettabytes of data being produced, it's the only technology we know which can unlock signals, which can unlock value from that sheer amount of data. Prior techniques that... Now, what are some of the problems? And I'm acknowledging these are fundamental problems. When you're learning from old data, and that old data has been processed by humans in the past, that means every bias that humans have had for the last 30 or 40 years is going to be present in the insights that artificial intelligence brings forth.
Right.
I don't think we want to codify every one of those biases. I'm not calling them malicious. I'm not putting a value on it, but implicitly and explicitly, all those biases will propagate forward. What should we do around it? Should we pre-bias it? Should we make it more explainable? Can we put other data mixed in that gets rid of those biases? That's one example. Where is it ethical to make use of artificial intelligence? There is so much been talked about in this era of social justice. Should we use it for facial recognition or should we not? What are the ethics to do with that? Not just the pure algorithmic aspect, but all of that. Should we use it for giving people mortgages or not? And when we begin to look at the areas and impacts of quantum, which is down the road, well, once the machine is there, it could maybe break encryption. Should we let it break encryption? So there are so many questions that open up, and you need depth of expertise in the technology, because there's also science fiction. AI as singularity, where it's going to take over the planet, I actually think that that's a bit beyond the pale. May happen, but likely the third generation from us, best case, and by the way, I put that chance at pretty low, because having multiple exponentials build up on each other doesn't really happen in the world of science. So I put those aside. But when we know these other problems are going to be there, and how do we begin to address it? How do we make sure that tech works in service of humanity and not let it become a tool only for a few people? As you hear some politicians talk about weaponizing tech. So let's avoid the weaponizing and let's make it a service for all. And so I think of very few schools that could bring to bear what Notre Dame could bring to bear in terms of helping work with us in partnership to make progress on that topic. Sorry, I know that this is a topic which gets me excited, Marie Lynn, but I think it's really important to be able to have technologies that are explainable and that people understand what they do and what are their biases as opposed to what they're not. Something I know that appeals to you personally also quite deeply, not just to the university.
Absolutely. So I'm well familiar with IBM's ethics first approach. Excuse me. And I noticed in your last response, you made a little bit of a sideways reference to facial recognition technology. And I can only assume it's because you know the degree to which that issue is important to me and important to many people, especially to people of color across the world. So this past June, in a letter to the US Congress, you wrote, and I'm going to quote you here, IBM firmly opposes and will not condone uses of any facial recognition technology, including facial recognition technology offered by other vendors for mass surveillance, racial profiling, violations of basic human rights and freedoms, or any purpose which is not consistent with our values and principles of trust and transparency. We believe now is the time to begin a national dialogue on whether and how facial recognition technology should be employed by domestic law enforcement agencies. So I just got to say, wow, that's a powerful statement, and one that I admired it when you issued it. I think it was back in June, and I still admire it. So tell us about the decision to exit from the facial recognition technology line of business and how your ethics first philosophy informed that decision, and how the Tech Ethics Lab can help foster this national conversation that you're calling for.
So very, very deep topic, Marie Lynn. So if I step back to this, so artificial intelligence has always driven a few areas. So natural language processing, image recognition, which very soon leads to facial recognition. And I regard the science aspect of that as being actually good to do. We humans are gregarious. We love to recognize people. There's so much research done by psychologists and early childhood people. What is it that kids learn? We are pre-wired to recognize faces. Whether or not we'll ever be able to prove that babies smile when they see their mothers
They
or
do.
maybe fathers, right? It implies that facial recognition is pre-wired in us. Babies certainly cry when they see people they don't like. Okay, so it's not a surprise to me that we should do a lot of research there. Now, putting that into practice, especially in areas which can have such a dramatic and profound impact on implicit bias in society, like policing, surveillance, borders, etc., when there is such difference, and the science shows the error rates for dark-skinned people are 10, 20, 30% higher than for light-skinned people. The error rates for gender within skin color, you can begin to go even more out of whack. Now, is it just because of the underlying data? Is it because of the fundamental science? We don't know. But when you can observe that the technology, if misused, can cause a lot of irreparable harm to certain segments of society, then you got to pause and say, what is the right thing to do, even if it costs you business? And that is why we took the very strong stance to say there needs to be a dialogue. When can you use these technologies in policing or not? Policing and health are sort of unique areas of society. It's really important that we step up to a much, much higher standard. By the way, as many legal standards in the country have always said, the standard of what is provable in a court is much higher than what we use in normal conversation or a normal human interaction. And I think that some of those same should be brought in. But that's my thinking. We are a single enterprise. So then we say, how do we get this in a much more thoughtful dialogue by people who think at this intersection? And so working with the university who thinks about that intersection and is an unbiased voice. Nobody will accuse you that you're out for profit or you're out to make a name for yourself and being able to sell more, is why it's really important that you get that impartial but expert opinion weighing in on what should happen. So the reason we took the stance is that technology is not mature enough, in my view, to be used for policing. If it could become, then the question is, that's the dialogue. What are those standards that when you observe them, you could maybe put it into use in those circumstances? Who should drive that dialogue? It should be somebody who's an expert, impartial observer. And that would become more the university. So that's, to me, the three layers. But it's also important in that one, I think action speaks louder than words. So in the middle of all those things, we are not going to be political as a company. That's not our place. But I'm going to separate policy and politics. We do believe that we should lobby for good policy on the few areas where it makes sense. And so precision regulation on the application of these new technologies is an area where we believe that we will lobby for getting policy put into place. And then it's up to the legislature and voters to decide on which of the policies being put forward they want to have put in. So, sorry, long answer on that topic.
Oh,
a really
great answer.
Topic at this time. And a way we believe that it's possible to then move the dialogue to a positive place between the citizens and government.
Yeah, well, Notre Dame is really looking forward to engaging in those conversations with IBM, but also fostering a broader conversation across the country and across the world around these critical issues. We're built for those kinds of problems, and we're so glad to be in partnership with IBM about them. So here's my last question. We live in perilous times. You mentioned three things earlier in one of your responses. I'm actually going to mention four. So we live in perilous times. We have a global pandemic. We have economic dislocation. We have racial unrest and protest. And we have ravaging impacts from climate change. We're seeing that as well. And because of the pandemic, our usual ways, we're primates, right? Our usual ways of connecting with each other, and we come together physically, and we come together physically to find hope and to find solace and to find new ideas to cope with all of these things that we're facing. And that act of coming together physically for that hope and solace and innovation are not available to us right now because of the pandemic. How can advanced technologies help us remain fully human in these fraught times?
Really, really deep question, Marie Lynn, and one that we all struggle with. First, I think one-on-one video interactions amongst people who know each other at least somewhat, even though we know each other well, I think actually do work quite well.
Yeah, I agree.
Completely focused on the other person, you're reading their body signals. Look, I am one of those who believe 95% of human communication is nonverbal. It's not my statement, it's somebody else's, but I find it to be completely true. What you can pick up from a single either smile or nod or eye movement or facial movement is 100 times more powerful because it's much harder for all those signals to lie, whereas words can often be very polite, I'll call it, not necessarily false. I think one on 1,000, one on hundreds is also quite effective using these technologies because when you cannot get in person, you need to over communicate. That leaves the problem of how about a 10 on 10 meeting where there are 10 people trying to wrestle a problem? I would say we have not yet found a great technology answer to that. But there are then ways to mitigate it. Why? People can talk over each other, they shout over each other. You can't see 10 people's body language, whereas around a table, it's a little bit easier to do that. We haven't yet figured out how to do that yet in a great way on all these technologies. But there's a counterbalance. I think using messaging channels is a great way for people who may be actually somewhat shy to speak up in an in-person forum, that they can speak up. Giving people time and more flexibility on timing to be able to give their inputs, etc. So I think on the first couple, it's probably better even than being in person. For the middle one on the small group interactions, it's a lot worse. But let's try to make it up by being more polite, by giving people more forums, and also by avoiding what, unfortunately, the internet does sometimes, which is by, I call it mass hysteria of people piling on and really being negative. So let's be civilized, right? I mean, there's a reason we call it a human civilization, that we don't need to get as rude as people tend to get and shut people down because nobody likes being insulted, even on cyber media. All that being said, I actually fundamentally believe there's going to be a new way of working. If I look at our current ways of working, we tend to follow, I'll say, I can go back to Adam Smith and the pin factories, but we have really all the way to modern workplaces. It's really an evolution, a very slight evolution of the Industrial Revolution. Let's take large number of people, there's a clock, the dong goes off, punch your time card, come in. Okay, as opposed to sitting at a machine, you're sitting in your cubicle, you do that, you maybe walk around a little bit, and it's time-based work. And really, we are human workers, we are knowledge workers, we are mostly white-collar workers, and we are living and behaving as if we are doing piecework. So maybe there's going to be more of a hybrid approach also going forward, where there's going to be a mixture of, I'll call it office and where you work. And now we get into all the questions that your researchers should worry about. How do you measure productivity? Should people be paid for by the clock, or should people be paid for the work they produce? How do you not put subjectivity in there? I think this has opened up so many questions. And then it's going to open up all the questions of urban versus suburban versus small town, because if you don't all need to be in one place, then maybe it's not all urban. Maybe urban is going to be for different reasons than all this. So many things go through my head around this topic, but as you can see, you can have a glass half full or half empty. I'm the glass half full person. Always look for what can you do more positive going forward. And I think all our modern technologies of instant messaging, of group forums, of being able to convey your opinions, of being able to share private messaging, all that provides you probably a good 80% of the mitigation, 80, not 100, of what one could do in person. I do miss the serendipity when you have have a thought and the person you want to discuss it with is next door, and you can walk around, poke your head inside the door and say, can I just talk to you for a minute? I know I'm interrupting you. And you often get more out of that. And I don't know how to fully replicate it because we're all a bit more polite about interrupting somebody when they're somewhere else, because they could be in the middle of a video call with somebody else and we don't know that.
Yeah. And so I really liked your characterization of the one-on-one and the 1 on 1,000. And then that middle area is the one where we need to continue to do some optimization, and maybe we can help you think about that. Also, all of those IBM workers who are looking for a beautiful place to live with good schools and affordable housing, I say we welcome you to South Bend. So send them our way, Arvind. And on this whole, this whole question of how we optimize that interaction, we've been experimenting with a number of things. I'm actually, as you may recall, I'm a big fan of 1 day a week where I have no meetings. Because having time to think. And I've found myself in current times actually picking up the telephone and talking to people because I miss that serendipity. So rather than going around the corner, I have that thought I try to pick up. So I think we're all needing to learn some new ways to operate, and you've given us such wonderful food for thought. So Arvind, what a joy for me to have a chance to catch up with you, and an even greater joy for me to have an opportunity to introduce you to the whole Notre Dame family, although many of them probably knew you already, but to have this conversation for the whole Notre Dame family, for them to get a chance to get to know you better and to get to know IBM better, and also get to know more about the partnership that we're developing between IBM and Notre Dame. I can't wait until COVID allows us to be together in that same room, in the same room, and exchange these kinds of ideas in that incredible way that takes place in person, in that incredible way that primates crave, right? So thank you so much for joining Industry Insights. We are really grateful that you joined us today. We're even more grateful about the Tech Ethics Lab, and we're looking forward to doing great things with you and with IBM. Thank you so much.
A privilege to be here with you, and thank you for the opportunity and the time.
Take care.